in North America, Canada. Good afternoon to those joining us from across Europe. And then good evening for those that are joining us from Asia. So we have a global audience today. We're expecting 105. I'm actually in a very good mood. I've just been to my boy's speech day, and unexpectedly he was made head boy today. So obviously leads to the question of whether he's actually mine. But anyway, that's one of the things we can discuss later. So today's session is around the complex question of purpose. And what we define as the missing ingredient. I'm going to come back to our esteemed panel in a minute. I just wanted, for those that are joining us for the first time, just to give you a bit of colour. So we have 90 minutes today, and just to a bit of a backdrop. Most of you will hopefully know who Armstrong Wolfe is. I'm very privileged to be the CEO of Armstrong Wolfe and managing a hard-working, talented and long-suffering team. So as an organisation, we are a COO advisory firm. What we do 24/7 is plough the furrow in support of the Chief Operating Officer, CAO, Chief Control Officer, Business Management. This is across buy and sell side and to investment banking. At the heart of it is the international COO community, where we've got over 50 global organisations which are corporate members. And whilst the COO is at the heart of what we do, as it is at the heart of each organisation, we've leveraged the goodwill and the position of the COOs in relation to what we do with women in the COO community, which is led fantastically by our own COO, Graham Wilcox, where we've got over 2,000 managing director, senior, very accomplished women within business management roles across financial services. The role of WooCook is to not just to give a network to this cadre of leadership, but really to inspire tomorrow's leadership, be it female and male, and actually to educate them about the role of the COO. Most COOs on this call, I think, will find I'd probably say accidental COOs. And what part of our mission as a company is to make the COO a career destination as opposed to an accidental journey. We also have the Armstrong Wolfe Advisory, headed up by Piers Murray and Wade Younger in the US. And they provide execution services into our community. Armstrong Wolfe Institute, really this subject falls into where we work with multiple different partners and actually creating innovative ways to train, develop business management globally. And finally, the COO Academy, where we're working with a company called Genesis in the US, which is creating pathways of opportunity for the underprivileged in New York. So that's who we are as a business. The background to this is that we've all been aware, and the community has been aware, of the inherent challenges that have been placed upon the industry throughout the pandemic. Managing a workforce in a desiccated or distributed pattern, the strains and the stresses that's put on culture, the pressurized, the emerging focus and shift from management to leadership, and it's manifested itself fundamentally in fracturing people, a lot of employees' view of their overall commitment or decisions in the first place to stay within financial services. So that's led to what we call the great resignation in the US. But it's no longer about the anticipated merry-go-round from one asset manager to another or one bank to another. The asset managers and banks are losing their good people to well-capitalized technology companies, and then losing them beyond that to out of industry. And therefore the question has been in relation to how do you engage your staff, your colleagues, how do you engage the people of your organization to make sure that they are going to retain loyalty, they're going to remain focused on serving the organization that they are employed by and the industry they're within. And I think the industry is somewhat struggling with, if you look at hybrid, is swinging between the carrot and the stick in relation to how to deal with that. And one of the things that we put to question, we ran four COO dinners at the beginning of this year in New York and London. So it's over 50 COOs around the table in total. We did a spot survey around what are the principal challenges that a COO has or priorities in 2022. And those are the results in front of you. You can see that well, when the influences on morale and defining culture, it's arguable that you would have seen that compensation may have been probably number one historically, but actually the balance of people's views on what's important to them and the diversity of what's important and the mix that we see there, 11 sort of different categories, each with a different weighting. That is the challenge that the COO community and corporate leadership have in relation to being able to hire, retain, and develop their staff, enhance productivity, and therefore deliver enhanced profitability. Purpose is one of those pillars that I think is actually misunderstood. It's been that sort of fluffy qualitative stuff out to the right. You'd find it occasionally on one of those, on one of the Venn diagram which is presented by leadership, or on a granite stone as you go into the reception of a bank or asset manager. But what is it, and how can you actually operationalize it? And when we introduced this terminology, there was a sort of a lot of questions about whether it is plausible to do that, or indeed what purpose is. And that's what this conversation about is today. So what we're going to do, first of all, before I introduce the panelists, we just go to the next slide. For those on the call, we'd like you to participate in a survey that you've now got 81 minutes to complete it, actually. So if you could go onto your laptop, your phone, your desktop, your 40-inch or 70-inch television, because you're obviously wanting to watch the panel in their full glory, and actually complete this. It is essentially exactly the same survey that I've just shown you that 51 COOs undertook. So if you could, if you can actually just log in, do that, and then Holly, if that could be sent out to the attendees, that will be great. So we're going to give another 5 seconds on that. So we've got menti.com and code 97021010. And we all look forward to dissecting the views of in fact, we've just got over 100 that are attending today. So now to the most important part, and you'll be delighted to know that it's not long before I'm quiet. So if we could actually go to the panelists, please. I'm delighted today to have a really enriched panel, which will all give us a different perspective on the same challenge around embedding and operationalizing purpose. How do you, by doing so, can you maximize business performance? And yeah, as importantly, position that organization to hire and retain the best people for that organization. So all the panelists I've known for some time in different ways, whether from an organizational perspective or individually. And I'm just going to ask them to just briefly give a bit of potted background, so you can see when you look at actually the mix of the panelists that we've got a very compelling collective view and intellect that we're going to enjoy the dialogue this morning. Ted McDonald, sir, I've known you for many years. A little bit about yourself, Ted.
Okay, very briefly, I spent 35 years in investment banking in origination roles, risk management, and governance, and then 7 years with the FCA, specializing in sort of conduct and culture topics, more recently with the Financial Market Standards Board. Purpose didn't always feature highly in my career. It didn't exist in many respects until gradually, suddenly it appeared. So I'll comment a bit on that and how it evolved at the FCA.
Thank you, Ted. Nancy, I mean, Societe Generale has been a huge supporter of Armstrong Wolfe for many years, and in fact, ran the first leadership evening for women in the COO community in your New York office. So Nancy, delighted to have you with us today. A little bit about yourself, Nancy.
Thank you. So I'm Nancy Harrington-Jones, and I have the very cool title of Chief Culture and Conduct Officer, a position we made up here to answer, big bad banks, how are you going to deal with your culture problems? I've been also in investment banking 35 plus years in many roles, internal audit, IT, control roles. I was the head of HR for a long time, and now in this role.
Excellent, thank you. John Coleman, I first met John when he was an active participant and supporter around the asset management COO table when we started that community some 4 years ago in New York, and now an accomplished author, just one of his many skill sets within Purpose Itself. John, a little bit about yourself.
Morris, thank you so much for having me today, and thanks to Armstrong Wolfe. It's a pleasure to speak with y'all. I've been in and out of management consulting and asset management for a couple of decades. Started at a small hedge fund, worked at McKinsey and Company, Bridgewater Associates, and then spent 9 years at Invesco in a couple of COO roles in which Morris and I got to know one another, and then leading a couple of our investment teams. About a year and a half ago, I joined an investment firm called Sovereigns Capital to lead the firm that does values-based investing. And as Morris mentioned, just really passionate about this topic of purpose. So I've written 2 books for Harvard Business Review touching on the topic, most recently the HBR Guide to Crafting Your Purpose, and then run a newsletter monthly on the topic of purpose, and think it's just incredibly important to what we do.
Thank you, John. And now to the other John. I was introduced to John via, funny enough, a COO. And John is the guru of purpose. His firm specializes in creating that bridge and understanding how to operationalize purpose and then build the commercial case for it and for make the whole world happy. Is that what it is, Mr. Rosling?
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't need to say anything now. Well, sort of. I mean, I think what's true in that is that we are very interested in purpose as a conversation about how to make better business. And that's because what we observe in organizations is purpose actually does drive performance ultimately. What is difficult is to know how that process works. And that's why we spent the last 5 years in a huge project with Cambridge universities and now a vast group of global academics trying to actually understand and be able to measure purpose and how it's activated in real organizations. And I think we've measured in 28 countries now, organizations of all different sizes. And it is a fascinating story about understanding genuinely how this abstract concept can change human and therefore commercial performance in companies. That is our mission. And it's a big topic. But thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. And then Carl, Director of Leadership and Development at Syonic. We've worked extensively with Syonic over the years as well. And I think what attracted me to Syonic was not obviously just the credibility and the caliber of people like yourself, Carl, obviously, but it's a hybrid between true practitioners, industry leaders that have then transversed into consulting and those from consulting, so that they've got an enriched and fully rounded perspective. That's why we've worked effectively with Syonic. And Carl, you're a little bit about yourself then, sir.
Excellent, thank you. So again, it's an absolute honor to be here, folks. My name is Carl Hewitt. As Maurice said, I am a consultant at Syonic, and I work in the learning and development practice, where I design and deliver development programs on leadership and things like high performing behaviors across various clients within the banking industry. I'm also a leadership coach, and I've coached hundreds of professionals within that industry. And prior to moving to Syonic, as Maurice said, I actually worked in practice for about 25 years in the finance sector. I worked predominantly in transformational change across a broad range of organizational functions, such as operations, finance, risk, business-facing departments, or front office in an investment bank, as well as in compliance and operational risk. I am absolutely fascinated by purpose and the behavioral science of it, or the organizational psychology of purpose, which is where my academic interests are. And as I say, it's absolutely fantastic to be on this panel. So thank you, folks.
So I think you hopefully agree with the audience. We've got the perfect purpose panel, and that's not something that you're going to be able to say after a glass or two of Pinot Noir. So what I'm going to do, just like to say that we have the chat box. We want people to raise questions. We want people to bring dialogue, and we want people to bring questions and dialogue and narrative to the panel. I'm going to go through the panel, giving they'll be talking that from their own particular angle around the purpose. But this is an interactive session. We do what the collective, that's all of us, the panel, and also the participants get out of this is by what you put into it. So the more questions we get, the more rich the conversation will be. And then by the end of the 90 minutes, we will all be able to go into the weekend knowing exactly how to operationalize purpose. That's a simple objective. So if we could just drop the fine slide, that would be great, Holly. And welcome to those that actually are on visual, and welcome to those that are hiding, but welcome to all of you. Nancy, I'm going to come to you first of all, Nancy. Okay. That you're obviously, as you said, that you've got a unique title, and you're you're at the heart of an organization that is grappling with this and that subject. So I'm thinking from someone who's in the seat, who has actually seen the challenges that have evolved and emerged through the pandemic, and now that you've got this gift of this position, and what are the views that you have and the challenges you're facing from a staff perspective, and potentially where you feel that purpose could actually be a key ingredient for you, helping you achieve your personal mission and therefore the mission of the organization?
Mm-hmm. So thank you. And, when we started this journey, talking about culture, because that's where we started this journey, there were three drivers. One was the regulatory environment, right? We had to start talking about culture, thinking about culture, dealing with culture. We also had to change our business model at the time, really to become a client franchise, which, if you know, Societe Generale was not. It was prop shop, at least here in the Americas. And the third pillar that we've always talked about for this driver for change was the change of the expectations of our talent. And when we started this, the word purpose was not as, on the tip of our tongue, I would say. But we definitely knew that all talent, whether inside or trying to attract, or even as our clients, were looking for something different than maybe I was looking for when I started my job, or I knew I was allowed to look for. I think we all wanted to, be proud of where we were, right? We all wanted to be proud. So it doesn't surprise me that leadership is first on that survey, because you want to look up to the people that you're with, right? You want to learn something. So I get the leadership part being very close to purpose. So it was a big driver of what we were doing, and I would say continues to be even bigger. It grows, the expectations of people wanting to have that, what I call pride, wanting to feel connected to what they're doing, what we spend so many hours of our day doing. And everyone has their like personal place where it fits in, right? And once we start knocking against that, that's when things break. So some of the things that we do, well, it's for SG, anything you read about us on our own stuff, right, where we publish it has the sustainability in it. And I think that's kind of the center of purpose, whether that be about the way we try to have the balance of our work and our life, the policies around that, or the way the clients that we deal with, or the business activities we will be in, or the sectors that we will be in. So it's sustainability all through, and we try to be very clear about that with our people. And one thing we do, even when hiring, we do something called a culture and conduct interview. And it's very simple, and it's really, I consider it more of I always say a cell interview more than an assessment interview, but it does both. But what it does is try to explain to people the organization we are, that we care about how you do your work, not just about your technical skills. We care really about the values that we tout, and they're not just words on the wall. And we explain what that means and how it can impact you and where you're going to feel it in your work with us. And that's really to help people understand where they're going and to set that stage. And, if you're not interested in that and you're all about the deal and the P&L, which we like the deal and the P&L, but we have this other aspect that you need to be thinking about. We want to make sure that it's, clear, and we're all together and in it together, going toward the same goal. So I would just say that's part of, the process of really making that evolution of, everybody doesn't want to just come to a bank anymore or an investment bank anymore. As you say, there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of choice, which maybe wasn't around when we started in this industry. And we really have to change. I think we really have to change and understand that people are looking for a lot of things when they join an organization. And I think purpose or pride, culture, the way we do things and the way we work and what we do, is really important to them. We're not hearing you, Maurice.
No, you probably weren't missing much. So, so can I ask you, when you joined the industry, you talked about it was almost natural, you had this sense of pride and purpose, and you were able to almost like hang your hat on it and sort of I'm working for X, and people understood that's what that X was. Where do you think that the journey today, where's that been lost? Or I just wonder whether you think there was whether was the pandemic just a catalyst for accelerated change, or where do you feel as if that partnership between people coming in and innately understanding what pride and purpose was and what they're doing, to actually now having to the fact that we're having this conversation today?
Yeah. I don't think it started with the pandemic. I think that was another disruptor that brought it even deeper. But I think the financial crisis, honestly, was, or maybe even the one before that, earlier one, were really the catalyst for it. Our CEO at the time, I remember him speaking at our first Culture and Conduct conference about being avoiding telling his doorman what he did for a living right after the financial crisis, because he was not feeling proud of that, and he was kind of hiding it, and he didn't want that to be, because we do good things for the world if we think about it, right? We have a necessary function that finances, infrastructure, etc. It should be prideful at some point, and wanting to bring that back. So I think financial crisis that we talk about in 2008, but even the one before, really were catalysts for this. And the next disruptor was this pandemic, where we all started to say, what is that? There's something else in life. I commute to work 1 or 2 days a week, and I come back and I say to myself, how did I do this 5 days a week, however many hours a day I was in the city and all of this? How did I do that before for so many years with, I don't even have that anymore, with little kids and, sports and, all the other things that you do and juggle in your life. And I think this time of the pandemic for us anyway, those of us that had the ability to work from home, really made you stop and think about, what is really important, and what am I willing to compromise on, and why? And that why is the purpose part of it. It's if I'm just going in, which is fine, if I'm just going in to collect my paycheck and maybe I don't care and I want a nice name on the door and the most money that's going to be in the paycheck, that's all. That's good. That's a driver. That's your driver. And then, at some point you start saying, is it butting up against my own values and my own view in the world? And how long can you sustain that, So this is where I think everybody started thinking about life and work and your reasons so differently during this time in the pandemic, if you had the ability to work from home and have that. When I came back, I was when we were just starting to come back from the pandemic, my CEO at the time asked, can you start speaking to some of the senior managers and see how they're doing, and what it's going to be like when we change this, so you work from home all the time. And many people, they're all MDs or directors, in their career for 15 or so plus years. So, and many of them said, Nancy, I don't want to, I want to have dinner with my kids once in a while. I don't want to give that up. And I never did it before. I would, see them on the weekend, but during the week I didn't have dinner with my kids, and I want to do that, and I'm not willing to give that up. Maybe not every day, maybe I'm just going to do it one day or whatever, but I'm not willing to give that up. Yeah. And that was, those of you that are in the industry, that's a big statement, right? To make that choice for a lot of people. It sounds simple, but it's not simple. So I think this time really gave people that. And then of course you had the summer of, here, social injustice, and you have all the climate crisis, and, depending which thing triggered you, your purpose became much deeper and much more in the forefront of what you were thinking about when you returned to work physically. Yeah,
Thanks.
that's my view. That's my view. I'm not an academic here. I'm just,
Well,
you
so
know,
we're going to transfer to an academic now, actually,
yes.
whether he likes it or not. That's what I can refer to him as. But it's very interesting that I've got my own thoughts around sort of the articulation of purpose, which I can bring in later on. But and the expectations you talked around sort of leadership and importance and we are in the UK, that for those in the UK, that we are dealing with that today in relation to our the present government and the leader of that government, our Prime Minister, where their ethics and their integrity they are being questioned, and they see, and the common view is that is the part of the purpose of government is to serve the people, and to do it in the manner they do it. They expect honesty, they expect integrity, etc. So we're living that today. The BBC's got a frenzy about it. So I'm going to pass now. Thank you, Nancy, for that setting the scene. John, you've been in and you're still in, but you are fascinated by this subject. So picking up from what Nance is saying, I'm particularly interested in actually narrowing down and just focusing on what is purpose and how do you articulate it, or how would you get someone who is, say, from a fresh graduate to a VP through to an MD, all sort of being on the same song sheet in relation to what their what purpose is. Right? John, your academic and intellectual thoughts would be much appreciated.
Man, the academy is going to suffer if I'm suddenly considered an academic. That's lowering the standards of an entire profession, Morris. Look, I think purpose is a really intuitive concept, actually, and it's not terribly important that we get a definition precise. I think that people understand that purpose is what gives your work and life meaning. It's what makes the activities that you engage in valuable to you. And I think of creating a flourishing life, so one that's whole, that's fulfilled, that's prosperous, that's important, is some combination of balancing purpose, which is what makes life meaningful, with joy, which are the things that you actually enjoy, right? If you can combine those two things, in most of the things that you're doing, you're leading a flourishing life, one in which you're not, it's not a grind all the time. Sometimes things can be purposeful, but not super fun. I've got 4 kids, 9 and under right now. They are super fun sometimes, usually not at bedtime or when I'm changing diapers, things like that. But that's a purposeful activity. I got to get through that part to get to the fun stuff. And there's some stuff that's fun, but isn't terribly purposeful, right? I always use the example of The Great Gatsby, where all the characters have a ton of leisure time and seem to be having a lot of fun, and their lives are ultimately meaningless. And so I think it's that focus on giving your life this whole sense of meaning. Just to pick up on a couple of the threads that you all touched on, I actually think, and one of the reasons I've written on this a couple of times now, that we're living through a prolonged crisis of purpose that started even before, as Nancy mentioned, the dot-com bubble or the great financial crisis. If you look at surveys going back 20, 30, 40 years, particularly in the Western world where those have been conducted more rigorously, we are right now at, and even pre-COVID, but particularly post-COVID, at all-time highs on things like anger, on frustration, on measures like loneliness. So if you look at surveys out of the US, and they're similar to those in the UK, if you surveyed people, older people in the 1970s and 80s, only about 11 to 20% regularly felt lonely, whereas now that number is 40 to 50%. In the US, at least, this thing called deaths of despair has actually caused average lifespan for certain communities to decline. These are things like suicide, alcoholism, drug addiction, which are often an outgrowth of feeling disengaged from your life. If you transmit that to the workplace, global surveys indicate that only about 15 to 20% of people feel engaged at work on a global basis. And even in the US, where there's theoretically more fulfilling work, better working conditions than some places in the world, that number is somewhere between 30 and 35% of people feel engaged at work, only about a third, right? And I think that one of the biggest missing components of that is this idea of purpose and engagement, that people feel not just at work, but in their entire lives, right? I think the challenge of that is, how do we as an organization not just define an organizational purpose that gives them meaning, because you can't give someone a singular purpose to define their lives, But how do we create environments at work that allow an individual to find meaning and purpose in a holistic sense, that allow them as an individual to flourish, which is a combination of those things that make their lives meaningful, those activities that they love, as Nancy mentioned, which people rediscovered during COVID, time with your family, the time for avocations outside of work or hobbies, ultimately coming to face with your own mortality, the ability to focus on relationships, both inside and outside work, while also at the workplace creating positive cultures where people feel that they have deep and meaningful relationships, where people feel that they have an opportunity to serve others in their daily job, which we can circle back on. But in asset management can be really hard, right? We may serve a pension plan that then serves retired firefighters or teachers, but the average staff accountant's not going to meet the teachers that they're working so hard to support, right? And so we get this distance from purpose that a classroom teacher might not feel, for example. And then finally, how do we as an organization define a culture and a mission for that organization that also resonates with that individual and gives them a sense that their professional life really means something, that they're working for something greater than making the bosses rich or making myself rich, which really doesn't make anyone terribly satisfied. And so as leaders, I think the big challenge for us is to think, how can we actually create environments where each and every individual in this company can begin to live a life that they consider flourishing? That will look very different person by person, but is important for each and every individual. And then secondly, how do we define a corporate culture and purpose that allows all these different people with these different sources of purpose to kind of row together and work in the same direction on these critical topics for the organization in a way that improves performance? And the last thing I touch on that Nancy mentioned, and then I'll be quiet, is, all the evidence would indicate that culture is the greatest competitive advantage in business. We've predicated our entire investment model on this. We looked at some research. I'm blanking on the exact numbers right now, but out of London Business School about the best places to work in culture, regularly outperforming their competitors by 300 to 500 basis points in the market, right? You look at things like employee retention, you look at things like productivity. In high culture environments with high trust, where people feel engaged and purposeful, businesses function a lot better. And that's not why we do it. We do it so that people can lead good lives, because I think we as leaders care about that. But if you care about the success of your business, I think all the evidence would indicate that if you can build a culture where people feel that engagement and purpose, that your business is much more likely to succeed as well.
John, can I ask just for Khadijah's come up with a point on the chat. If you just want to have a quick look at that to answer that, and then there's another thing I wanted to both ask to you and Nancy. One of the points that's been raised from one of the conversations we have is actually we talk about this generation or the generation that went into banking and they intuitively understood pride and purpose. But actually, the educational system is actually sending into society people with a different view of the world. And actually what we perceive as purpose, which was innately part of potentially what that generation did, whether that was about sense of service and to society and that translated into sense of service into the corporate entity, and doing the right thing was what was expected to you. So how much do you feel then that the way that the focus in relation to how we educate children and tomorrow's leaders, early leaders, has shaped the problem, the challenge that we have now in relation to not necessarily their expectations, but the way that they look at the world?
So, wow, there's a lot to unpack there, Morris, because I think
there is, and we've got the rest of the afternoon.
One of the so I'll hit on one topic that I think is kind of a part of our culture that's permeating, and then I can try and address the question in the chat as well. One of my views in the most recent book is that people in the Western world in particular, but I think that's broader now, particularly as culture has globalized, I think have a fundamentally flawed view of purpose and actually maybe look too much to their work to define their purpose. And that's one of the things that holds them back. So we have often been raised in culture as young people with what I think of as like a Hollywood version of purpose, right? It's the hero's journey where you're looking for that one thing to define the rest of your life. typically a professional experience, right? It's Neo in the Matrix working kind of a boring job and then finding out he's got this great mission, or Rey Skywalker on Tatooine realizing that she can be more than a scavenger and go do all these things. It's this idea that as a young person, you're going to find one thing to redefine the rest of your life, and that singular thing is going to give you purpose, right? There's a falsely attributed quote that people attribute to Mark Twain that says the two most important days in your life are the day you're born and the day you find out why, which is kind of romantic and inspiring, and ultimately terribly anxiety producing and false. My contention would be that rather than purpose being a single thing and something that you find, I think that contains three misconceptions. This, you've heard young people ask all the time, how do I find my purpose, right? And can my company help me find my purpose, right? Which is kind of a flawed way for them to look at it. Way too much pressure on the company. I think, you don't find your purpose, you build it. So I think that in almost any profession, you can make your life meaningful. And if you go profession by profession, you can find examples of people in professions that you and I would consider really tough and purposeless, bus drivers, janitors, etc., whose ratings of purpose and meaning in their life are sky high in their work. And you can go find cancer doctors and teachers who have really meaningful work, who feel that their life is meaningful and purposeless, right? It's not, purpose is not something you find. It's a mentality of how you build. And there's a lot of work on things like job crafting right now that are aligned with that. The second is, I think that people have a misconception that purpose is a single thing. I have a colleague right now who I was speaking to recently, and her son is having a challenge launching right now out of home. And one of the challenges is he's looking for the perfect thing that's going to guide the rest of his life. He's just paralyzed by this idea that he doesn't know what he wants to do with the rest of his life. And he's like 22 years old. I still don't know what I want to do with the rest of my life. And I'm well older than that at this point. And my point to folks like that is, look, purpose is not a single thing. Purpose is actually this tapestry of stuff around you every day. It's your kids, it's your family, it's the relationships you have in your community, it's your community service, it's the hobbies that you find meaningful, it's the 20 colleagues that you love at work, it's the service that you can provide to providers, and it's the mission of your organization. It's not single-threaded, and you don't have to be paralyzed. What you should do is try and acknowledge all these sources around you and kind of maximize them. And then the third thing that I think we could help people understand is that purpose changes over time. So one of the things with the Great Resignation, I think, is that people looked up and had some time to reflect and sit in their offices and go a little stir crazy. And they thought, oh my gosh, I'm middle-aged and I'm working this company and I'm just not like fired up about it anymore. I'm not in love with it anymore. And anyone who's married kind of knows that feeling when you've been married for a while and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't feel in love all the time anymore. And you realize, wait a minute, there's actually a choice to just be in love all the time. And you've got to choose to kind of continue to find purposeful paths. And it's totally okay to redefine what your job looks like in a job so that you can make it more meaningful, to transition to a new phase of life when you're investing in something new. But I think that this idea that you're going to find this one thing that defines the rest of your life, which so many young people have today, contains these fatal errors that just prevent them from feeling that, and in fact cause a ton of anxiety when they're not able to achieve that. And then just briefly on the topic in the chat, I think the synthesis of the question is, isn't this like a first world problem? Like, we're all rich enough that we can like sit around and think about purpose. If you look at the survey data and things like that around the world, there is some truth to that. So if you're living in desperate poverty, for example, if you're in the Democratic Republic of Congo right now in a war zone, if you're in Haiti post the earthquake, obviously in the hierarchy of needs, there are needs that are much more tangible at that moment, right? Where you're just worried about survival, about how much to eat, about whether you can live indoors, about disease, about violence. And I would never diminish that, right? Because purpose isn't the only thing that people worry about by any stretch of the imagination. But it's also true that most of the evidence would indicate that the threshold for feeling comfortable around those topics is much lower than we think it is. And in fact, if you rewind in the United States, it wasn't like in the 1950s or the 1930s or even the 19-teens. People weren't worried about purpose or meaning at all. It was just about survival. This is a common thread across countries. Once you reach a standard of kind of acceptable living, people very much worry about purpose and meaning. I mean, if you look at the world, you think about it, religion is one of the greatest sources of meaning for people. About 77% of the world self-identify as following some sort of religious tradition, right? When you survey people around the world, even outside of the most developed countries, they will list purpose and meaning as an incredibly important part of what they do. And one of the movements we've even seen in the US right now is that, people, as Nancy mentioned, are willing to trade off things like compensation for more purposeful work, right? It's not about just maximizing the material success of your life anymore. And I would say that's even more pronounced amongst young people now who have been raised to distrust that. I mean, you think when I was in college, we had the dot-com crash, Tyco and WorldCom scandals, went to war, the war on terrorism, great financial crisis when I was in business school, now the COVID pandemic, stagflation, recession. People, millennials and Gen Zers are very distrustful of institutions and distrustful that a future is promised that's prosperous. And so they don't want to wait to live a purposeful life until they've achieved material success. They want to shape a world in which they can feel that all the time. And so I think there's validity to that question in the sense that some people very much have to worry about more near-term concerns than is my life meaningful. It's about survival. But a lot more people are worried about meaning than you would think, and that threshold for material success starts much lower than most of us think.
Thank you, John. I think it's interesting picking up some threads saying that, that it's an individual's responsibility and they're accountable to themselves to actually seek out their purpose, not to outsource it to their, to a friend, to a parent, to an employer. Because I also feel there's a sense of we are all gifted with choice. Every morning you've got a choice. Do I want this to be a happy day? Or do I want to be a grumpy day? I mean, just try that out over the next 2 days. You consciously have that choice of how you're going to frame your and how you're going to respond to things in that day. And it's up to you to actually define that journey. Yes, some people are going to try and impact that day, but you're the person that's in charge of your emotions, how you respond to it. John, you've actually the other John, you wanted to bring something in, John.
Gosh, that's so efficient. What a brilliant conversation. I'm just slightly conscious that this conversation can feel very overwhelming because what we tend to do is start to conflate different things. So we have an absolutely fantastic, brilliant exposition of personal culture and meaning, personal purpose. And then we have a really interesting conversation about business ethics and business morality and treating people in a humane way. And neither of those things actually are necessarily addressing the question that you raised originally, Maurice, which is about organizational purpose. And I think the problem is intellectually, we go on this journey into lots of different areas. And then we come back and say, but I don't know what to do to resolve this problem because I'm now told I need to have an organizational company purpose and I don't know how I'm going to do that. So all of these things are so true and so brilliant. But I think this conversation value, we should remind ourselves or come back to the central question, which was about organizational purpose. That was all I was going to say.
But John, don't you have to weigh individual purpose to what the corporate purpose is? You have to have they have to be siblings at least for them to be, because otherwise you're going to have a disconnect between what someone's individual purpose is as opposed to their purpose is to go left and the organization's is to go right. But how do you recognize that whilst we're talking about corporate purpose, that the sibling of the corporate purpose is the individual and therefore the collective purpose or sense of purpose of their employees?
Well, I mean, they're all three. If there are three things, absolutely valid and important. So, personal purpose. What is my personal meaning? And an employer could say, well, it's my responsibility to support someone on that. That is, however, distinct from an organizational purpose, and it is perfectly possible for an organization to understand its purpose and just set it out there and attract those people who are going to be attracted. Now, what Unilever, my old company, came up with is they then realized that people then needed support to understand their own personal purpose and some of the stuff that John was so eloquent about. And then the third area is just being a responsible, humane, ethical, good employer. And those three areas are all important. And if you look at the work of Blueprint, which is a charity in the UK that does a lot about this, they try and bring all these concepts together. My only point was that although these things are equally important, what ends up happening is it's all so overwhelming. And that organizationally, operationally, what we need to do is find a way of making sense of this that's simple and actionable, rather than theoretical. And I think clarifying why the organization exists in exactly the way John started his brilliant exposition. Why do we exist? I mean, that is the simplicity of what we're trying to do. And you can argue that you're not responsible for individual people's purpose. If you set out your stall and they choose to join you, that's great. But it's a choice then about how far we go to support people in their own purpose journey. But to conflate the two runs a risk of nothing happening because we just get overwhelmed.
Thank you, John. Just picking up this point with Sue Primer in the chat, I think that will probably get a few people's actually response to that. But so Sue's saying about is there need to be honest about the purpose is to make money for shareholders. Yeah, but it's not, maybe that is a component part, but it's how you do it and to what purpose is that money going towards. Yeah, and I just actually that.
Sorry, yeah, I did just respond to that. It's one of the things, but if you only focus on that,
Yeah.
I think it's why so many of us, many organizations got in trouble. You know, it's about also the client and the financial system that we have to support and regulations and our talent and all those things feeding each other. If you're only focusing on one stakeholder in the equation, something's going to break.
And you could argue when ESG, you could argue that actually that can be tied to purpose in relation to we are here to make money, but actually the purpose of that money is now going to be directed in investment in X, Y, and Z. There was a case, I had a dinner with a number of COOs in the US about 3 or 4 years ago, and we were talking about purpose. I said to ladies and gentlemen, what's your purpose? What's the purpose of banking? And there was, there was that, which returned shareholder value. There was to make money for for our investors. There was, and I said, well, okay, so what do you do? What do you actually do? And then I said, well, we create liquidity in the markets. And I said, well, so yes, bring in my 80-year-old mother. God bless her, she's not with us now, but she's an erudite, intelligent woman, and she's going to look past you by about 1,000 yards when you go, yeah, what do you do as a job? I create liquidity in the markets. I said, so what's your output? And then we eventually got to this, okay, so what does liquidity in the markets does? It creates funding channels, it creates investment. We're investing in a new car plant in Detroit, which can create employment, which can create food onto the plate of the family, which can create the ecosystem around it with the boot cleaner, the dry cleaner, the grocer on the corner. And I think just sort of almost taking them on that journey of, we are part of it, we play a key role, the industry does, in that end outcome. Is yes, it's making money, but it's what is that money for? And actually, Ted, if I bring you in, that you've had the view of being, you worked extensively with the FCA, for example, now at the FMSB, looking at that journey from like the control environment, which is like, so how are you making this money? Are you a safe haven? Is it good stewardship? To actually, then we had the culture from the FCA in relation to tell us how you demonstrate to us actually how you are changing your culture. Now they've gone into, and what is the purpose? Why are you doing it? I mean, Ted, you've listened to some great contributions here. What's your view from your particular seat?
Well, so far I've got a crick in my neck from nodding my head so much, because I'm quite in agreement with what's being said. And I think it's true that the 2008 sort of period was a bit of a turning point. What did we think about before 2008? And no one was talking much about purpose, but they would talk, and I think they did talk about like value add. What's my value add? My personal value add? What's the value add of my company? And this was a common way to sort of think about it, and it internalized it to some degree. But it still wasn't as sharply focused as purpose. And when the external questions started to come up, and trust, and the headlines and newspaper headlines and stuff, purpose started to rise up the agenda a little bit. When I joined the FCA, they were in the process of transitioning from the idea of adhering to rules, don't break the rules, to becoming outcome focused. And really focusing on the outcome. Like, I don't care exactly what rule it was. You're doing a bad thing. Let's let's address it from that kind of point of view. And I think that that was really healthy, and it enabled people to shift, and this was necessary, to shift from the idea that policy and process and training was the big answer, because it isn't, not by itself. In addition to that, you need to bring things to life a little bit. I like the way John's, I think of things as like a big tapestry or an amalgam. There's all sorts of things on the patchwork quilt that need to come together to work. Corporate purpose, personal sense of purpose, and lots of other personal development things are essential to making any of that work well. And what you want to see in your organization is for that tapestry to get sort of stronger and brighter colors and more colors appearing, because staff are helping one another to some degree in that individual development. And that's where I think we still have the biggest gap. The FCA was focused on conduct for lots of good reasons, and introduced various programs, and Tone from the Top was one that was there from 2008 and perhaps earlier, or treating customers fairly, all that stuff. But it wasn't enough, because people weren't getting that sort of extra bit about, well, why do I care? And as an organization, financial services company, how do I translate that into the outcomes that you want as a competitor, and how do you convert this to thinking to become like a competitive advantage? And purpose was a galvanizing term that helped do that. That people appreciated fairly early on, that elevating purpose, not substituting it for anything else, but elevating it as part of the patchwork, made a difference. And if your staff were with you to some extent, that also made a difference. And we often let off conversations with firms before we start, before before the supervisory interview begins. We just talk about purpose for a minute and get quite relaxed about it, and let people reveal to some degree what's going on. And we were quite interested always in, well, what are the staff actually doing, and how much of this is coming from your staff because you were talking to them about it, rather than your comms department or your HR department or some other Tone from the Top speech. And gradually, that increasingly started to happen, that there was a much more tangible staff discussion. And some firms reported that they threw out their purpose statement. They had a big staff survey, a bunch of focus groups, blah, 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 for 6, 9, 10 months. And the purpose actually evolved. And so I'm a believer that your purpose is what's reflected by all your staff, not what you've got stenciled on the lobby wall necessarily. And there's all sorts of variations thereof, all of which can be good, some maybe not. Worry about those ones, but encourage that sort of evolution. I'll just finish this by saying one of the final things we did in that 5 conduct program before lockdown was interviewed VP level staff across 18 organizations, 10 at a time per bank, just to have a chat about regulatory topics, and purpose was one of them. And the personal sense of purpose question was most commonly identified as, no one's ever asked us that, especially a regulator. I have no idea. Well, actually I do. And yes, it's very important. And it became like the most important thing, that a personal sense of purpose and some sort of alignment with the corporate purpose was absolutely fundamental. One person out of 179 people said no, it didn't matter to him. He was just going to leave himself at the door and do whatever he was going to do, and it didn't matter if it matched or not. Only one out of 180 people. So I think that was really important. And the fact that the energy coming off this group was so strong and powerful, that was the most riveting thing that we learned. And we tried to say so and convey this in our report. And so it's a bit like we felt like you needed to invert the pyramid. That Tone from the Top was great and it helps, but It's the staff. If you forgive me for inverting the pyramid for a second, that group, that big group, already gets it, and they just need to be supported, rather than have another inoculation about doing the right thing, or it's bias training time, or whatever it might be. So they needed broader support along the idea of that broader tapestry of personal development, which includes purpose. So I think that represented a sea change from 5 years before, where if you mentioned purpose, it was, or even if you mentioned conduct and culture, it was, what do you guys want as regulators? It was a new thing. So I think we're in a much better place, and we're well placed now if we keep talking about sort of the tapestry and how to develop as individuals to apply purpose and create it and forge it, than if we think of it as some sort of technical tick.
Thank you, Ted. Before coming on to Carl and John, I'm going to bring in a couple of you, whereas I know that you've had different careers working with different organisations, probably different perspectives. So I'm going to pick on you. But Khadija, that you've already brought at one point in. What's your view in relation to the conversation and the response that John gave to your question? I just wonder whether you can give your view, and obviously that you're and actually locationally where you are, and some of the specific challenges that you would have being a global COO, but where you're headquartered, and how you would potentially, that shapes how you're looking at this, which will be slightly different to someone, say, in a New York or in a Paris, etc.
I think John's response was fairly comprehensive, and I do think that some of the and maybe, I mean, John took it from, he's not going to dismiss the importance of emerging market needs, which could be closer to more breadline, let's call it, issues, but I was locating it very centrally to where we are from a financial services landscape perspective, and whether as corporates we really have the luxury of which some may argue is a little bit of navel gazing. But I think both what John said and what Ted said now is really the nature of, and I think the most important part about John's response is the level of distrust with institutional credibility and how much we've lost through successive crises. That has meant that the employer proposition has to just be that much stronger, and the recognition that, I mean, and John's point around, actually, people have thought about purpose for the last, let's call it, 20 or 30 years. I just feel that sense of need to feel fulfilled and to have a drive and motivating force has definitely been amplified over the last 5 years. And I don't know what that is as a consequence of, because you could argue that, maybe some of the existential threats from a climate change perspective, etc., has just, and the recent pandemic has kind of sharpened the mind on where we're at as a society and the extent to which we all have to add value. So I think it's been a really good discussion on taking that topic. And just in terms of where I'm located, I think both in the emerging markets, so from a South African employee standpoint, as well as globally in all of our offices, it is something that we feel very strongly about as a firm, and we've had to really grapple with how we articulate that in a way that resonates across regions in a very authentic way.
Thank you, Khadija. I'm going to be someone from a different perspective. Tom Latten. I've known Tom for many, many years. Yeah, he's tolerated me. Actually, sorry for picking on you, Tom. Tom was so Tom left the industry. So that's why I'm asking you, Tom, that you've probably got to say a degree of time, and you're looking back into it with a degree of objectivity, and you're listening to. You would have been in one of these seats previously, and actually, I mean, no, I'm not a platform to give you any form of sort of accolades, but I'm going to give you one. So when I used
don't do that. Don't break that habit of a lifetime.
No, well, here it comes, Tom. It's your annual compliment. So when I used to do research for you, one of the things that your colleagues and your people that you were very principled in relation to what was important around creating a culture and the responsibilities of leadership in the basics around integrity, honesty, being upfront with people, which in itself created a culture and probably manifested itself in the collective purpose. I mean, listening to this, Tom, you've got, as I said, that you've got a little water under the bridge since you were in the lion's den. What anything that you can give us from your perspectives?
Yeah, sure. Okay. I mean, I think there's a difference between purpose and values, although I think they do coincide. I think, but I think from the employment standpoint, I've always thought of employment as like a simple equation in many ways. The employee gives their skills and their time, and the employer gives them cash and experience. And that experience can be motivation, it can be credence and sort of flattering ego and all those sorts of things. But it's just a simple equation. It has to stay in tune. And listening to some of the comments, I don't think anyone can just go to work just for the cash element. I think because there has to be some experience as part of it. And usually, things break down when that equality becomes an inequality one way or the other. So I think you've always got to offer an experience which is good to an employee, or to gain as an employee from your employer, a good set of experience that goes alongside the cash. You can't just keep adding cash to make up for a crap experience, basically, whether it be you've been under promoted, your boss is dreadful, the values of the organization are crap, or whatever. So I think, in terms of, but that's values, I think, perhaps more than purpose. I wonder with purpose, is it part of and I worked for some global banks, I worked for some global European banks, some global American banks. I've also worked for, a startup asset manager, as well as a UK wealth manager. So I've sort of seen a panoply of size organizations. I wonder with purpose, I found the least purposeful organizations were the big global megacorps. And it's because they couldn't, their ambitions were so big, it was very difficult to think how you operated within them. Whereas it was dead easy to find purpose within a startup asset manager that was, when I went in was loss making. As I retired, it was really quite profitable. That I wonder if just the scale of organizations that we all work in now, or some people work in now, are just so great. It's difficult to find how you match yourself to the purpose of those organizations.
So actually, thanks for that, Tom. I presume the reason you retired is because you took it from loss making to.
Actually, and a breakdown in values between myself and someone I worked with, I think.
So, Andrew, Mr. Murphy, if I could bring you in now, you have worked and are working for a very large organisation, and actually, although back in the UK now, you spent many years working across APAC and being a regional head there, so that you've had the challenge of managing across a multi-jurisdictional, multicultural, multi-layered region. And I'm just wondering, and I know this subject is of real interest to you. In fact, you put some comments in the chat. Yeah, picking up on what Tom's point is saying, is it the challenge of doing it in a large organisation? I know you've got some direct views on that. I just wonder whether you could share that.
Yeah, thanks, Morris. I mean, I think that Tom's point is at the heart of, I think, most of the large organisations, is about how you make a culture and purpose tangible to staff, something that is real and meaningful. And I think at the heart of that's because most purpose statements, I think, are generally very poor. And I think to the point that was made earlier, they've sort of evolved making generic statements about, oh, well, we're here to be client-centric, we're here to return, give value to our shareholders, and they're very generic. It's very common across most organisations. Therefore, for the particularly, and it doesn't have to be new staff, but staff, even actually for staff who've been in those organisations for a very long time, they find that hard to relate to, because it's the same words churned out in a slightly different way by the next CEO that's coming into the organization, or the next executive board that's evolved in that organization. So I personally, do think it's hugely important that even in large organizations, you have that common thread through the organization, and you have something, particularly in a hybrid and remote working environment, where it is something that people can talk to and relate to. And my personal experience in the organization that I'm at the moment is actually, we came up, the new CEO came up, he came in and said, we need to have a purpose. And people were quite cynical. She went, oh, here we go again. It's another CEO coming in. It's another statement that'll come out that the executive board in glorious isolation have come up with. It won't really change anything or mean anything. And actually, what he did, he actually, I think Maurice, you may have done, or someone commented earlier, actually the purpose statement that we came up with was one where we spoke to a large number of people within the organization, thousands. We talked to clients, we talked to shareholders to understand what was important to the different, to all these different people coming from different positions and I guess in different perspectives. So it wasn't just something that was an ivory tower purpose. It was a purpose that was created. It took us 6 to 9 months to do it. And actually, when people heard that actually was, wow, okay, that's a bit different. That actually means that you've taken the time and you're listening to your employees, but you're talking to clients, you're talking to stakeholders and shareholders as well, and that was really important. And actually, the statement that we came up with was much more around, how do we, looking at our business and the scale of our global business, how do we actually connect our clients to reimagine the power of investing to create a better world? So we brought sustainability into that, we brought clients into it, but we also brought our employees into it because we were contributing to that purpose. So actually, from a very cynical perspective, which a lot of people had, actually, when you were able to link in the themes which are hugely important, all of us are thinking, well, as we look around and what are we going to do? What are the generations after us going to think? What are our clients? How do we actually not just be about making money? How do we actually look at our client base and help our clients also fulfill their own desires and ambitions, a lot of which are around improving the world and creating a more sustainable environment. So we were able to interlink different components of what we felt was really important to our own staff, our clients, and ultimately a positive outcome for shareholders and investors, to create something that even in a large organization we think and hope is much more tangible and real, where even people doing the lowest jobs feel that they are contributing to that outcome, that purpose, and sort of are starting to see how they can contribute to it. To Tom's point, it is extremely challenging when you've got 60, 70, 80,000 people across multiple jurisdictions. But certainly our experience of coming up with something, a purpose statement like that, has been hugely positive. I think for the first time in over 20 years of that organization, I've actually seen that is something we talk about. People talk about to each other. In the past, people never spoke about purpose with each other. For the first time, we've actually got to a stage where people actually are talking about the purpose. It's embedded into our conversations. It's embedded into the communication that comes through the organization. And I'm hopeful that actually this is the first time where we're going to get some success. Always be a challenge, always be people who don't buy into it and people who are somewhat cynical. But I actually think that, that actually what we've come up with, we have a better chance of success than probably I've seen in the last 25 years.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Before I know that Dave Prasad's I just want to bring him, he's had his hand up. We've got 19 minutes. I'm already going to pre-position this in relation, because I want to go from Dave, and then I want to bring from Dave to Carl to John. But I think actually what I'd really be interested in, those listening, if you could find out any questions or anything that you would further like answered, I'm going to request that these panelists reconvene sort of in the autumn, so then we can then elevate everything we've heard today to really focus on the kind of case study. So how do you do this in an organisation which is with 1,000 or 20,000 or 50,000? Bringing it back to what John of the Rosling variety said. Well, let's just talk about what this is about: creating a purpose in a corporate within a company. So Dave, Prasad, you want to do it? You had your hand up.
Just a quick thing, and I missed a lot of the meeting, Maurice, so I'm sorry I had a prior meeting, so it may have been covered, but I just wanted to go through briefly at BMO. You know, our CEO has been pretty bold in a lot of things. One is a purpose statement, which he had spoken to a lot of people before he actually published it, and it was really the mission statement, or I would say the purpose statement, as he calls it, is to boldly grow the good in business as well as in life. And I think for everybody in the firm, it really resonates for a number of reasons. One, it's, you know, grow the corporation, grow it with your clients, but also grow it in your community. And I think that resonates with people because one of our, you know, key foundations at BMO is helping the community. So I think it really resonated with a lot of people to see that, you know, BMO is not just about, profits are great and earnings are great, but also doing well in the community. And I think it also helps when we go out to recruit people to keep those things in mind. And I know, a number of people, when they recruit, they ask those types of questions about community service and things like that, because it is important. So I think, getting something that the entire organization can get their hands around and feel good about was really done well by our CEO. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Dave. So now we've got, I'm going to give sort of 5-6 minutes, Carl, just give any observations. Then I'm going to jump to Mr. Roslin to sort of capture the essence of what we can and almost like then use that as a platform. And hopefully the panelists will take this in relation to set a follow-on session. But as I said, in the chat or directly to Holly, any of those in the audience, if you can send any questions that you've got or any thoughts, we'll integrate and marry those together so we can use that as a structure to set follow-on session. Carl, I've said enough. Your views is that the baton is yours, the stage is yours, the curtains are open, everyone's got ice cream.
Fantastic, thank you. So I will only take 5 or 6 minutes, and let me build on some of the insights that we've heard so far, and maybe bring in a consulting view on how to actually operationalize many of the things that we've talked about. And I want to do that through telling a story, which I believe illustrates some of my core views on purpose, but also how to cultivate this in your teams and individuals. I think it's a story that you'll be able to relate to. So the story starts with a change management team who've been tasked with running a program to reduce costs of a department by offshoring a material proportion of a specific function. And this is something that I was actually actively involved in. So it's an anecdotal story for myself. Now, the reason given that the firm needs to do this is they need to pursue a very carefully considered strategy of cost reduction in order to protect the future of the firm, as well as to protect the cost effectiveness of the service to millions of customers. Right? Very rational reason. Right? But if behavioral science has taught us anything, it's that we are not particularly rational or as rational as we think, right? So that didn't quite cut it for the team that were tasked with actually doing this, right? They knew people would be placed at risk of redundancy, and what's more, they knew those individuals, right? These were folks that had worked alongside them for years, right? So there was a personal element to this. However, the team had a very strong and positive culture in that they felt comfortable to have the difficult conversation without fear of judgment. They were, you could say, a psychologically safe team. They also saw themselves as change management professionals. They were experts in their field. So they identified more with being like a doctor, right, able to give a professional opinion and professional advice, as opposed to, say, waiters who just simply take orders. Now, that environment of courage, of capability, of empowerment, of belonging was championed by the head of that team. And that was the catalyst for a conversation about purpose. So the team talked about their shared values, which included things like treating people with decency and respect, being transparent, being inclusive, and seeing other people as people and not numbers, not milestones. So being the change professionals they were, they already had some skills, right? They had skills in behavior such as creating, collaborating for success, and building shared understanding, establishing rapport and conceptual agility. So they took their ideas, their values, which up to this point were just words, and they combined it with their existing skills, and they turned this into actions, such as to build close partnerships with HR and legal, to secure a dedicated budget to help those affected to get interview training and career guidance, and simplifying the at-risk process using some of their formidable change management skills to remove red tape and possible confusion. They also made sure that those people who were affected were part of the transition planning process so that they themselves had maximum flexibility. They cultivated, if you like, a powerful sense of shared purpose within the team, and then enrolled the wider stakeholder community, which linked to their values and the program outcomes. Now, when I bring this back, when I reflect on this experience, one of the things I think we can do is to make learning sticky. And I like to tell stories because I think it helps to make learning sticky. And I find it useful to look at purpose as farming purpose, a little bit like what John was saying in terms of building purpose. Now, farming is a little bit unusual, but what do I mean? Well, let's go to this example. Number one, the team had already created a fertile environment of empowerment, of psychological safety, of belonging, of capability. And that environment was capable of cultivating a shared purpose. As they identified the seeds of purpose, their shared values, they knew that those seeds need to be planted, they need to be watered, they need to be nurtured, right? So they actually took action. They planted that in the minds of the wider stakeholder community. They used their collaboration and influencing skills. They nurtured those green shoots and to enroll others. And they made they produced documents like, clearly articulated set of simple principles. Basically, they did stuff. And then as momentum grew, they doubled down their efforts through consulting with those affected, simplifying processes, and providing transparency. Now, it was far from an easy program, right? But it did turn out to be one of the most successful in the portfolio, and people openly commented and acknowledged the efforts, the compassion, the understanding of the change team in helping their colleagues through what was one of the most difficult periods in their careers. So I think that we can operationalize purpose through seeing it as something that can be cultivated. And powerful purpose is authentic, it's engaging, and I would also say it's noble. Yet you've got to divide that by ambiguity, because if you don't really know what your company does, it takes away from that authentic, engaging, and noble sense of purpose. But importantly, in this story, people don't need to head out. So very similar to what John Coleman was saying. People don't need to head out and look for purpose and hope that they stumble across it, but rather with the right skills, the right leadership support, the right environment, the right culture, people can have the ability themselves to cultivate a powerful sense of shared purpose. And that's how I see purpose. So I'll pause there, and Maurice, maybe you can fire some questions my way, or yeah.
Well, I think what I'm going to do is that we've got 9 minutes. As we said, what we want to do is now tee this up for follow-on sessions, and those on the call, we'd like you to come back and we'd like you to bring some of your colleagues that you think actually they're going to be relevant to this call, and we want to then focus on, right, we've now got the entity, we've now got the corporate, that's what we're going to focus on. So John Rosling, this is what you do. It says what you do. You do what it says on the tin. You operationalize purpose. You've heard different views from some in the audience, from the panel. John, what are your thoughts? And can you sort of take us on the journey? Don't tell us all the answers. Just whet the appetite, and then be able to set the store for the follow-on session. I'll give you 8 minutes, John. Then we're going to have 1 minute looking at the results.
Thank you. That's more than enough. Yeah, well, I mean, what an amazing conversation. So I'm going to start by disagreeing with Andrew Murphy, only in one sense, that I think it is possible to have a really clarifying and galvanizing purpose in an organization of any size. And I hope I'll demonstrate how that might be possible. But other than that, I absolutely agree with what Andrew had to say. I think we all seem, it feels to me that we as a group of people are seeking a better kind of organization, that we want to be part of and leading organizations that do better in the world. And we are struggling to understand how that is possible and how that is relevant. And this purpose word has been brought into that conversation to say, oh, well, this is the answer. But then the way we use that word, what that word means to us, is so many different things that it becomes confusing. The question you posed to us as a panel, the challenge you posed, Maurice, was this statement: maximizing business performance relies on defining, embedding, and operationalizing your purpose. Now, that is a hell of a big statement to make, that your commercial business performance is entirely predicated on your purpose, on defining that purpose, embedding it, whatever that means, and operationalizing it, whatever that means. And I think, but it's an interesting challenge to make, because if that was true, that would be interesting. And it is sort of what Larry Fink has been saying, without him choosing to provide any evidence for some of his theories. And it's something that Alex Edmonds, that's been mentioned in the chat, who's a brilliant guy, and Grow the Pie is definitely worth reading, has worked towards, or started to work towards. But I think we don't understand the process specifically enough, with enough precision. I mean, I think we acknowledge that for most businesses, probably 80 or 90% of the asset in the business is sitting in the humanity within the organization. So we need to understand how you leverage that asset. We're then kind of thinking, well, human beings are meaning-driven machines. We want to feel that what we do is meaningful. And by that, I mean that it matters. Exactly as John described it, which I thought was brilliant. You know, why does what I do matter? And now, that absolutely is a relevant conversation personally, but organizationally, it's just as relevant. How can I articulate how what we do collectively matters? Because that's what the people who work with us want. And I thought it's really interesting that Nancy said, well, I think this has changed. Actually, I think that hasn't changed, but I think what's changed is people's confidence and the language they have to express it. I suspect that when we were kids, we all wanted to be involved in something meaningful. We just didn't think it could happen or was relevant, or if we wanted to do something meaningful, we went and learned to play the guitar. Business has to find a way to be meaningful. And I think that, and you're absolutely right, Nancy, to say expectations of talent have changed in the sense that they're willing and able to express it. And in most organizations, we're finding if we're not able to provide that meaning, they're all leaving. So meaning is the key thing. But the question is, how is that sense of meaning translating into what Maurice asked us, which was business performance? And that's really what got us very interested about 7 years ago, because a lot of large organizations were kind of challenging us and saying, well, if you want to talk about purpose, we are not going to really do anything about that at a serious level, other than a kind of ESG conversation or a cause-related marketing even kind of conversation, unless you can demonstrate the commercial return. And that's what we've been doing for the last several years with now a very large group of academics globally. And we've now, as I said, measured this, or gone into organizations globally and measured it. And it's something I'm very willing to do for any organization. And we now have kind of millions and millions of data points. And without having hours of time to talk, there is a really clear correlation between purpose. So if you plot purpose down an axis and you plot performance of the organization along the other axis, you have a line like that. Purpose is a statistical predictor of performance in organizations. And that's true of a whole company. It's true of a team, a division, an individual. So if I recently just plotted all of the operating companies of one of the biggest insurance companies in the world, And they absolutely followed that pattern up like this, more purpose is more performance. And the regression is that way. Purpose drives performance. Now, what do I mean by performance? I don't actually mean what Alex Edmonds was trying to measure, which is share price, because we're not there yet. What I'm talking about is the performance of the humanity. People who get your purpose are probably between 50 and 100% more effective than the people who don't. It's as simple as that. Now, getting it, that then effectiveness, are they engaged, are they committed, do they care, are they innovative, are they creative, do they understand your strategy, are they clear thinking, are they making decisions quickly? That is what drives operationally your performance long term. So then the question is, okay, so what do these data points tell us about how this thing bloody works? Because it's all very well saying, write a purpose statement, stick it on the wall, and suddenly everyone's 50% more effective. That's ludicrous. And the last thing I will say in 1 minute is just to hint at 3 things that come out of the data really clearly, and which have been revealed in things that people have said. One is that if your purpose is not an authentic and consistent way that you as an organization are making decisions, it is a waste of time. So the first thing is it's got to be the absolute clear discriminator of your decision making. Think about Patagonia, how Patagonia works. Every decision is made to save the home planet. It's an extreme example, but we can all do it. We have a purpose, we know why. That consistency is what I call context. It's the framework for decisions. That will only work if people feel safe, psychologically safe. So that was a word that Carl used, this Amy Edmondson idea of psychological safety. If people don't feel that they trust you, then they can't act. So a big thing, purpose is irrelevant, really. What is relevant is the way we behave, and the way we behave must make people safe. So it's clear, I understand where we're going, I understand why it matters to me, I understand the meaning. I feel safe, I feel trusted, I trust. What will then happen is people take ownership. And ownership is the key that unlocks a lot of this. Because people go, I know why this matters, and it really matters to me, and I'm safe to act. Well, hell, I'm going to take some ownership and drive this forward because it matters. And what we do instead is we put in controls, we put in surveillance, we remove people's responsibility, we muddle and confuse them, the hell out of them in objectives, and then we're surprised that we don't have effective organizations. So to me, purpose only does 2 things. It clarifies and it motivates. And that's what it does. And that's why it drives performance.
Thank you, John. Perfectly set up, perfectly timed, as if you've got an hourglass in your head. So we are going to do a follow-on. We are going to do a follow-on session. I am going to ask for this panel to return. We are going to then elevate and just focus on. John, maybe you and I could work on. Let's look at an organisation. Actually, how does this work? How does Contextus do this? And then what we can do is bring in the rest of the panel on their view that have different views as we've heard. So if you were happy to do that, I'm doing this sort of sending a closed question out to the panel who'd be delighted to participate. Here's the survey. Well, so 30 of the call actually participated on this, but you can actually see that purpose is number 1. It's interesting that compensation slipped to 5. We socialized this with actually the one from the COOs. It's now actually 3:30 UK time, 10:30 North American time, and probably Pinot Noir o'clock in Asia. I would just like to thank the panelists, Ted, Nancy, Carl, John, and John, for a very rich conversation with different perspectives on the same challenge. I'd like to thank those that actually I threw the darts at and actually then responded with their own views. And I'd also obviously like to thank my team for bringing you together. We're going to come up with a date sort of which will be sort of, I imagine, September, October time. And we'd be delighted actually for you to extend the invitation to your colleagues so that we can all get a better look and understanding of this. Thank you everyone for listening, for talking. It's almost the weekend. It's only 8 days away until the weekend after that. So have a wonderful Thursday, Friday, and at the end of the day, if you're feeling a bit sorry about yourself, you could be Boris Johnson, and that's probably should send you away with a positive feeling of, well, at least I'm not. So thank you everyone. Speak to you soon, and thank you panelists. Bye bye.
Thanks, guys.